Lately, I've been meaning to stretch my knowledge of painting, and this means painting something outside of my comfort zone. This is Taurus, from Glory Collectibles, Tales of Everan. My name is your dad, and in this video I'm going to be painting outside of my comfort zone. This video was sponsored by Glory Collectibles. If you're interested, I'm going to leave a link for them in the description below. They are coming out with their Kickstarter very soon for their amazing sculpts and models that they've made. I would urge you to have a look in the description down below. Whilst you're down there, make sure to click the like, the subscribe, and hopefully I've earned that by the end of this video, and if I haven't, there will definitely be some instructions in the last few seconds. So to start this model, I'm not going to do anything that I'm not actually used to. Everything I do now is something that I do pretty much every model that I always paint. And that's going to be to start out with the skin tones. And for me, this is a small model. I want to make sure the skin tones have a wonderful gradient in them, a really smooth, awesome gradient. So I'm going to use my airbrush to cheat and get that gradient. I start out with a dark tone and I work my way up to the highlights. As you can see, I've also used a zenithal highlight over the top of this model. Zenithal is when you spray white ink over the top of a black paint. It doesn't have to be ink and it doesn't have to be paint, but zenithal refers to light coming from the top, or the zenith, which is a fancy word for the top, like where the sun comes from. This is where I start deviating slightly from my plan, and in this case I'm going to use bright hot pink to highlight the shadows. Can you highlight shadows? Let's just call it the highlights of the shadows. And the reason I do this is because I've seen this painterly type paintings on models where it looks like they've used pink as the shadow, and I'm going to use that pink in my shadow to try and force it this time. I then work on blocking off the other parts of the model, and for me this is going to be blocking off areas like the beard and other parts of the model. There are multiple different browns on this model, and I'm going to use different browns. I'm not going to show them in this video, but I will show you how the model looks at the end, and you can decide if my choice of different browns is adequate or not. In order to do the armor on this dude, I'm painting it black first, and I'm going to go over that with a loose brush of silver, dark silver to be specific. And yes, I did just say loose brush. No, it's not a dry brush, it is just a wet brush that is loosely thrown about the surface to create this texture. Once that has dried, I'm going to go back in with a panel line wash, which is from Tamiya, and I'm going to use that to darken all the crevasses. I'm also going to go back into the model and do that on any other part of metal that I had painted previously. And as you can tell, I didn't paint all the metal parts when I was supposed to. So this is the time I will go back and paint those metal bits. In order to create a highlight on his beard, I'm actually going to airbrush that in. This is perhaps a little crazy if you're not used to using an airbrush in this way. But if you're very careful and use a low pressure and a very thin paint, you can build up some highlights on areas that are surrounded by other areas that you don't want to get paint on. I also am going to paint the rest of the leather on this dude's suit, and this is going to be done very carefully with another wet brushing of brown. I then needed to get a little bit more contrast in the plume on top of his head, and I'm going to use a white base underneath, and then I'm going to spray over the top of that with an orangey reddish color to get a good gradient from the dark red to the light orange. And then go back in again with the pin wash and wash all those lovely crevasses. Also, you'll notice I'm going backwards and forwards, and this is because I'm trying to concentrate on where the light's coming from, and so I tend to get stuck in an area and forget that there is a back end to this model. I'm going to add some highlights, and this is basically just to show where I want the light to bounce off of. This eventually will need to be blue later, but we will get to that when we get to that portion of the video. Now on this Warhammer, I'm going to paint the juice that is inside of this bottle rather than the paint, because for some reason that is a much better looking blue. Unfortunately, it turned out to be a little bit shiny and I ended up having to spray a matte varnish over the top. But I did paint this all over everything to kind of tint all the metal pieces on this model. For the base, I'm going to be using a cool grey, and the reason I use a cool grey is to get a little bit more depth into the shadows of this piece. Now the rocks need to have the same light that I'm going to add onto the model bouncing off them too. So I'm going to paint this strategically in the darkened areas. As you can tell, this paint is very thin, and this is so that the zenithal highlight underneath will show through and help create a little bit of free shading. I'm going to mix up an oil wash for the base, and this is going to be consistent of white spirit, oils, black and a brown, in order to make some kind of dirty browny blacky color, and this is going to be used to paint all the crevasses of the base. But before I can use this on the base, I need to dry brush. Yes, this time I'm dry brushing a load of lighter colors over the top of those rocks just to create a little bit more highlights on the edges of them. And this is where I can start to use my oil wash now. It doesn't have to be precise, it has to just go into the crevices, and sometimes if it gets onto other things, it's okay. You can wipe it off at this stage anyway. Now for that lovely blue that I decided to paint over everything. The first thing I'm going to do is lighten everything up on the side where the blue is glowing from. And to lighten everything up, I'm going to use white at first, then I'm going to water down a blue ink. And this I'm going to spray over everything. This is to give it an overall bluish tone. I don't want it to be the same skin tones with a very light bright blue over the top. I want to gradiate from dark blues to light blues. I'm also going to use this dark blue in the opposite side shadows. I don't know why. I think it was right idea to do, but I don't know. I could have been wrong. I did it anyway. Whilst those colors were drying, I'm going to rim this base. And that's going to be done with gold instead of black, because this base deserves a gold rim. After I was done with the base, I decided it was time to add a little bit more highlights and push those highlights before I did the final object source lighting coming from the Warhammer. And to do this, I watered down some very bright skin tones and I patted them over the highlighted areas of the skin. And by patting, this is going to create a little bit of texture on those highlight pieces. So it might create a little bit more of that painterly look or realism. I don't really know what I'm doing here. Like I said, this is outside of my comfort zone. I then glazed a blue over everything that I wanted to highlight with the new light source that was coming from the Warhammer. I also used my airbrush to help with that glaze, and I just used that to create a little bit more solid saturation in certain areas. And this is where I lost most of the footage, and it doesn't really matter because the only thing that was left really was just to paint the Warhammer. And basically I painted it white, I shaded the edges blue, and I added some little lightning things coming out of the edge of it. And I painted those with a little bit of white as well, and a nice white highlight in the center. And that's where I called this model done. Hopefully you managed to take something out of this video that might help you paint your dwarf in the future. Maybe you're not painting a dwarf, maybe you're painting something completely different, but maybe there was some information that might help you in the future and give you some ideas. And if it did and you want to support the channel even further, the next thing you should do is watch another video of Groundeffected. And when you're done with that, share it with your gran, and if you still feel like you want to support even further, then you can look into the description for my Patreon. Now when I describe my Patreon, always describe it as you get nothing other than you support the artist who creates the videos you might want to watch in the future. And if you feel like this is you, then you can look over in the description for my Patreon to join up and support the Groundeffected. And speaking of supporting Patreon, there are a couple new patrons I would like to thank for their support right now. Phil 2205, Eugene Ananan, Mark Fountain, Ocelot01, and Chris Hyber. Thank you, my dudes, for your support. It's because of you guys that I'm able to keep these lights blinding my eyeballs and making videos that you might enjoy. Now, we are at my favorite part of any video that I ever made, and this is when I get to tell everyone who doesn't like my videos to kindly just f*** off. Now I need something for the end of the video, and my words are not working anymore. God damn you, words!